Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here with our second panel here at the Global Decarbonization Accelerator at COP28. Achieving Net Zero, Transforming Today's Energy Systems. My name is Reed Blakemore. I'm the Director of Research and Programs at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. And it's a thrill to be moderating today's discussion, mainly because when we think about the scale of change that we're trying to achieve through energy transformation, it's incredibly impressive yet incredibly challenging, and I can't think that we would have any better panelists, both in terms of the scope of their coverage, but also just in terms of the talent that they bring to the stage here with us today. In order to make progress towards our net zero emissions by 2050, we need to transform how we think about infrastructure and how we deploy infrastructure. While investment in renewable energy generation has nearly doubled since 2010, infrastructure remains a huge gap to fully meet our net zero goals. For example, over that same period, 2010 to present day, global investment in electricity grids has barely changed. It remains roughly static at $300 billion a year. Yet at the same time, to accommodate increasing renewable energy generators, transmission lines need to be expanded significantly, right? They need to be modernized with data-driven technologies, and we need to make sure that we're sustaining the reliable electricity supplies needed to bring that power to the customer. And so these big infrastructure projects are absolutely necessary, and despite them being so necessary, they seem to be getting harder and harder and harder to move forward. We have a complex geopolitical and macroeconomic environment that in some ways is complicating the pathways for private finance. A lot of these projects need to be focused on emerging markets in the global south, where you have complicated propositions around de-risking and things of that nature. And these are big problems, but big problems require big think tank panels, and that's why I'm glad we have you guys with us today. To discuss this, I'd like to welcome Cara Mangone, Managing Director and Head of the Sustainable Finance Group at Goldman Sachs, Greg Jackson, CEO of Octopus Energy, and Joaquin Rodriguez Hadraque from CEPSA as Head of Hydrogen, who's going to offer some interesting thinking about not how this is just an electrification problem, but also a fuels thing we should think about. Greg, I'd like to start with you. A huge piece of this is theoretical in terms of reshaping our relationship between generating energy and delivering that energy to the customer. When we think about this infrastructure challenge and the need to reshape the energy system, how do we ensure that the connection of new renewables to the grid and guarantee of clean energy effectively reaches that customer? And what are the tools and strategies we need to be thinking about? I think that's a great way to kick off our discussion today.
Yeah, look, I think you said earlier that the degree of change is going to be incredible. And I think if we think of it as change, it's really hard. But if we think of it as building a new system, new technologies, you know what? It's a lot less hard. And the first thing when you're doing that is to think that when fundamentally the product we're delivering to people is different, the way they're going to use it, if they're going to get the most out of it, will be different. And so, in a renewable world, electricity is especially cheap when it's windy and sunny, right? So if people can use more of it at those times, they'll get cheap power. If they get cheap power, they're going to be much more receptive to, in fact, they're going to be demanding this new system. And so I think the single biggest thing is understanding that, for example, an electric car is not a like-flight replacement with a petrol car. When you have a petrol car, you drive it around. When the tank is nearly empty, you go and fill it up. When you've got an electric car, you get home, you plug it in. It's like your iPhone. In fact, after a while, the idea of having to go to a petrol station seems pretty unappealing. And because you're getting home and plugging it in, we can just choose when we charge it. And you don't care if we're charging at 7 p.m. or midnight or 4 a.m., as long as you've got enough to drive in the morning. Well, in fact, you know what? You don't even care whether you're charging it on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, as long as you've always got enough electricity, enough in the tank to meet your needs. And so fundamentally providing new products and services to people that dramatically reduce the cost is the big opportunity we have here. And just one example, our smartest product for charging EVs optimizes every EV to have a different charging schedule every day, depending on the grid and other stuff. People using that product pay 7.5 cents for their electricity, when normal people, or normal times, it's 27 cents. That's the difference we can make. In fact, you'll get 1,000 miles for $20 on that product. You can't do that with a petrol car.
I think you bring in this really important idea of delivering this energy to the consumer is really incumbent upon a strong demand signal, and that demand signal is really contingent upon the price and the cost of that electricity in the first place. But that does, in a way, bring us back to this question around the economics of the project in the first place. And I think, Kara, I'd love to have you weigh in on this issue of, it seems cliche almost to say uncertain times, right? But uncertain times, whether from a geopolitical perspective or from a capital markets perspective, make the cost of some of these projects, much more difficult for investors, for private financiers, you name it, to really digest and understand. How do we think about these issues, and how is the environment we see today really shaping, the decision variables we have at play to get these projects done?
Thanks, Blake. Well, I think you have a lot of different considerations, inputs and takes, right? So on one hand, you have, as Greg, I think, said well, sort of a new transformation or a new energy system. You have, things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which certainly have provided a boost in terms of ways to transform the system in a commercially viable way. We actually think the roughly, $500 billion that you can get to through, Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, infrastructure bill, actually will likely end up being closer to $1 trillion, so double that in terms of incentives that are actually deployed. So that helps a lot on the cost side. On the other hand, we're in a rising rate environment, much higher inflation, that's clearly impacting supply chain significantly. So there's a lot of complexity, and then you add to that energy security, and I think net-net, we are in a place where it's more complex, but I think we're also having sort of very real pragmatic conversations on this from a financing perspective as well. I think that the other sort of dynamic that we're managing, which is not often front and center, is just, this is not necessarily just a replacement, given where we are in terms of energy, demand. We're seeing increasing energy demand, right? It's not falling. And our research estimates that there's about $1 trillion gap between energy demand, the financing of energy demand today. So I think anything we can do, to Greg's point, to optimize is going to be very helpful from a cost perspective. At the end of the day, if you look at any kind of research around switching and friction cost, and even among millennial generation in terms of consumer preferences, you really have to be as close as possible to kind of an equal cost, right? You have to make it easy. You have to, and that's what's really going to happen. So I think that's where you start to get at the demand. So supply side, things like the Inflation Reduction Act are hugely helpful, right? And that will start to bring the cost down lower, which then I think helps with the demand side. But it's not going to be easy. And I think one other thing I'll just say from a financing perspective, in terms of pragmatism, there's a lot of capital that's going to need to go into very hard to abate sectors. And so I think one of the things that we're spending a lot of time talking about this week here at COP is it's possible that emissions are going to go up before they go down in terms of the way we look at our own portfolios, just because the capital needs to get there. Once the capital is there and you can finance it, then that's how ultimately you will start to see decarbonization come down.
A few threads there that I want to pull on, but first I want to go to Joaquin, because Joaquin, one thing Kara mentioned is that there is a supply side piece here, and an operator like Cepsa, right, that has a commitment to reduce your emissions by 55% compared to 1990, right? That is leaning heavily into some of the new energy system pieces that we've already discussed, like green hydrogen, but also is thinking through and focused on some of these hard-to-abate type sectors, like that Kara mentioned, like heavy industrials. I'll start with a broad question for you to field in one way or another, and then I'll ask you a quick follow-up, which is, when you think about these new versus old energy system ideas, when you think about the challenges around financing, but nonetheless the urgency of our need to decarbonize quickly, what is your vision of the pathway for CEPSA to reach that 55% reduction in CO2 emissions? And, do these kind of emergent challenges put that at risk in one way or another?
Thank you. Yes, in CEPSA, yes, we have a commitment to achieve this 55% reduction of CO2 emissions, but we also serve customers who have the same kind of targets. And this is somehow a challenge and also a concern, because we talk a lot about 2050 to reach the net zero, but 2030 is about tomorrow in industrial terms. We need to develop large projects to achieve significant reductions. So what we are doing is concentrating in locations where there is already large demand for, let's say, hydrogen and derivatives, because this is the important, let's say, barrier to find the right off-takers. So first thing is to replace gray hydrogen with green. That makes a lot already. In CEPSA, we are sitting in 2 big refineries, which are big consumers of gray hydrogen. Just by replacing this gray hydrogen with green hydrogen, we make a lot in terms of reduction. But also around us, there are other industrials who also consume hydrogen. We are neighboring a fertilizer company called Fertiberia. There is also a copper company called Atlantic Copper. Between all of us, we consume around 200,000 tons of gray hydrogen per year. This is already a lot. But this is just the building block to become competitive in terms of size, economies of scale. But it's not only about replacing gray hydrogen with green. We want to go beyond. We want to serve our customers. And our customers are large, let's say, transportation companies, heavy transportation. And this is where it makes sense to put the efforts in the short term, because this is a very intense, very concentrated source of CO2. It's not a diffused and dispersed effort you must do to reach every single, let's say, retail customer, with a lot of infrastructure still to be there. We are servicing maritime companies, and we are sitting by the Strait of Gibraltar. This is one of the most dense maritime traffic in the world. And we are also servicing airlines. In Spain, it's also a very known country for the air traffic. So we are building on this basis of large, let's say, self-consumption, new sustainable fuel plants, and an array of different products. We are producing biofuels, from biodiesel to SAF, the sustainable aviation fuel for airlines, to replace kerosene. And then we are producing also methanol and ammonia, as we see them the best choices for the maritime. In the short term, methanol is a clear winner, because it's replacing straightforward the fuel oil, the heavy fuel oil for submarine fuel. But then we see in the long term that ammonia can be a winner, because there is unrestricted availability of nitrogen in the air, very easily captured. It's a well-known technology. And finally, when you use ammonia as a marine fuel, ammonia is also a very good carrier for hydrogen. So if we want to move then hydrogen that we can produce around our sites, where we have all the necessary infrastructure, we have connection to the grid, we have water, we have industrial land, we have deep water ports, we can move any excess hydrogen production to other locations which have less favorable conditions through the ammonia and using ammonia as the carrier, which is also a very well-known technology. So we are talking about very realistic things that can happen in the short term, and with a real demand that can offtake this product straight away.
I think one of the important features you mentioned there is this idea of an ecosystem of offtake, right? An ecosystem of product, right? That you can leverage as you move forward. But I want to key on one particular thing you mentioned, and then Greg, I want to come back to you. This idea of so many of your offtake points being directly related towards those heavy industries, right? Industries which possibly don't have the tolerance, perhaps, for the intermittency that can come from an activity like green hydrogen. How are your projects, how is this ecosystem of hydrogen infrastructure addressing those issues of intermittency to make sure that, each of your offtake partners isn't worried about, a gap in service or something like that?
Yeah, when you intend to produce something out of hydrogen, you need a stable flow of hydrogen. You cannot produce hydrogen moving up and down your electrolyzers or investing in massive hydrogen storage to balance the hydrogen production. This is very expensive, it's very difficult to manage. And if you talk about the grid, it's very difficult to keep stabilized electricity grid with high capacities. We talk about hundreds of megawatts. For an electricity system is really a challenge, no? So the way we do is we connect different sources of hydrogen production. We produce hydrogen out of electrolyzers, but we also produce hydrogen out of steam reformers. And you may say, steam reformers, this is gray hydrogen. Not necessarily, because we are using biogases. Biomethane, which is very abundant in Andalusia, in Spain, and also other biogases that we are producing ourselves out of the biofuels plant. With a combination of steam reformers that are very manageable, no, they are flexible, and electrolyzers, we keep the system stable, and we can make it very competitive, because when electricity prices are very expensive, or when there is no renewables at all, there is no sun or wind available, we can still produce hydrogen to serve the production of the downstream fuels, no? The ammonia, the methanol, the SAF, all these. And then we are directly connected to off-takers. So we are not waiting for hydrogen pipes to be developed to connect through thousands of kilometers to be permitted, no, to some very long distance off-taker. We are talking about off-takers that are sitting around us, or off-takers like aviation companies or maritime companies that are operating in airports or in ports that we can reach easily. So this is the way we do it, in a way to make it immediately actionable.
Greg, I want to give you the opportunity to, because I picked on you first to kick us off, I got to give you the opportunity to respond to everybody else. But I'm interested in your reflection on this conversation that we're seeing, right, around a ecosystem on the demand side, right, and also managing kind of the interesting opportunities and challenge that are kind of on the supply side, whether that be an opportunity in the form of IRA, but also these challenges in the form of broader financing environments. And how you think through those two separate issues with regard to advancing and continuing to beat the drum around demand for clean energy, right? One of the items that I think you've mentioned previously is, creating a fan club for renewables in a lot of ways. So a two-part question to you. How do we think through stimulating that demand further? But also, how do we take that into other parts of the world? How do we think about that in a developing world context as well?
So, energy only exists as an industry because at the end of it, there are households and businesses buying the product. Fundamentally, the demand side is the determinant of the entire sector. And once you understand the technology and you start providing different products and services, you get different demand, and then you change what you supply. It's what happens in every other sector, and energy shouldn't be different. You mentioned there about stimulating demand. And, the reality is that the single biggest thing you can do is price. And there is no cheaper form of energy than a locally generated electron being used at the time it's being generated. So one good example of joining supply and demand together was the thing you described there, the fan club, where we said, look, if we build a turbine near you, you can have cheap electricity when it's windy, very cheap when it's very windy. I think it's 20% off or 50% off. Now, we did that because we thought that way people would use the electricity in real time. So you'd need less storage, less transmission, less distribution. But it also turned out that people joined the dots and said, hang on, we want a turbine. We had 22,000 communities ask for wind turbines. So, look, if NIMBYism has prevented the building of infrastructure in developed countries, it's just because we haven't given people the direct, tangible benefits of that infrastructure. But the more we give them it, the more they have the choice. It's just like if a supermarket wants to build a new, outlet outside of town or a village, the people get to choose. Do we want the new cheap products, or do we want to avoid that development? And different communities choose different things. When it comes to the sort of developing world, the reality, there are two versions of a just transition. One of them is fossil fuels for Africa, right? I.e., people saying, look, the West got rich off the back of fossil fuels and now it's your turn. I mean, that would be crazy, because we're already at a point where renewables are cheaper and easier and quicker to build, as well as, by the way, not going to contribute to climate change. And the real kind of comparison here is with what happened with mobile phones. The internet via the smartphone leapfrogged all of the kind of old heavyweight landline infrastructure. Kenya's had mobile money while Americans were still scanning checks on their phones. Kenya was paying with phones. And so I think this is the opportunity to truly bring, after 800 million people don't have access to energy, we can change that very quickly and very cheaply by leapfrogging all of the old technology and going straight to the best, which is decentralized, renewables, in-premise, microgrids, and then slowly, just joining those up as and when required.
All right, Karen. Now I think we've now come to the point where we are actually talking about, we have these lessons around cost and price of power wins out, right? And in the developed world where you can make that happen, it's, you have that fan club very, very quickly developed, right? Because you can have that localized access to power. You can provide the advantages to industry of kind of more direct offtake partnerships. How do we think about those two issues in the context of the developing world, where you do kind of have some financing gaps, right? And you do have this tension, as Greg mentioned, between the choice of financing, fossil, right, projects versus financing, these renewable projects, which are increasingly competing on cost. How do we think about the financial environment within those two?
I mean, I'll just start by saying I find Greg's comments so refreshing, because I do think often in this seat, what we hear is, how do you just kind of shift your financing so that, we can just decarbonize these sectors as quickly as possible? And I think the reality is, it has to start with demand, right? It has to be that demand signal. So I think it's a great, really important frame for the conversation. Emerging markets are so critical to meeting global climate goals, energy transition. The IMF estimates that 40% of investment will need to go into emerging markets in terms of meeting global climate goals. And everyone probably knows the numbers. You're talking about multi-trillion annual investment, so 40% of that. So those are really big numbers. And if you look at areas like blended finance and concessional financing, which I think is pretty well understood in the market, are going to be really important to get at that investment gap. They haven't been increasing as rapidly as you would hope, I think, to get there. And there's a few different reasons why. I think from an overarching perspective, the conversation we're really having is, from a private sector financing angle, there needs to be the commercial viability there. And so I think when you look at emerging markets, the biggest challenge that we typically see with our clients in terms of investment is just it's high levels of risk. And so it's, can you compensate for that risk? And you can. It's just a question of how you end up structuring that. And can you get more higher levels of, I think, two things. One is more concessional finance. So having more, MDB funding that goes into those projects to help support it at base level is hugely important. But I think second is, within the private sector, we have a real opportunity to then multiply that capital, because we just won't have enough public sector financing, concessional finance in the world to actually get into those markets. And so, the unlocks that we see are creating that demand signal, but part of the way that you create that demand signal is you make it an attractive project for private investors. And then you have that demonstrated with engagement with local governments, extremely important. One example I'll just give you that we've spent a lot of time on is particularly in South and Southeast Asia. We created a partnership with Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Asian Development Bank, and they've been great partners. It's not something we could have done alone. We structured a investment facility, a blended finance facility that invested in 7 different projects in India and Vietnam. Everything from aquaculture to create seaweed that can go into feedstock to reduce methane, to helping to electrify diesel bus fleets and intercity routes in Vietnam and India. Those projects would not have gotten off the ground if there wasn't a level of concessional financing from us, as well as some innovative financing tools that the Asian Development Bank leveraged. And the ADB also knows those developers, right? They can work with the local government and figure out what's the right enabling environment. So I think the question is just, how do we get to higher multiples? Because what you need to be able to do is create that attractive risk return profile so that you can draw additional private sector investment in. And the example I'm giving you is we provided philanthropic first loss capital, but there's a lot of other examples of work that we're doing in our structured finance business in LATAM and other emerging markets where we are doing this. We're working on public-private partnerships, structure, commercial. We're doing this in our business to work on local infrastructure projects, street lighting, renewable energy projects. So it's there. I think we just need to be able to scale it.
I think just to put an unfair umbrella around everything you said here. When you were thinking about project viability and getting finance into emerging markets and these issues around de-risking, it sounds like it's really about where within the project pipeline from PowerPoint to FID, right? Are you beginning this viability de-risking process, right? And then how, right? And identifying being very precise in terms of the need case for that de-risking, and that gives the surety to all parties up from the regulatory side on through the private finance side to engage with a strong sense of kind of what that return is with an eye to those multiples. Thinking about those multiples, and I have this in my notes, and I'm quite keen to ask you about it. This idea around metrics and data and the finance community's use of data and kind of strategic thinking around financial variables and all those different things. That's not something that a policy guy like myself typically thinks of immediately when I think of the project pipeline, but it's critical. How can the financial community better leverage these intangibles in a way to better support longer-term decarbonization?
Well, look, it's been an evolution. So metrics it's such a broad question. So maybe I'll just tackle it in 2 particular ways from the bank financing perspective. One is, how do we think about the decarbonization net zero goals that we've set? And that really comes down to the way that we look at kind of our clients and counterparties and how we evaluate their progress and figure out ways that we can help finance that progress. And then the second bucket is an evolution that we're seeing with our clients, more on sort of the asset management and institutional investor side, asset owner side, in terms of how they're measuring portfolio decarbonization. And I think the crux for kind of both of those buckets are earlier approaches to the way that we measured investment in decarbonization had a few flaws to them. One was they tended to be more historical facing, so they tended to measure kind of backward-looking emissions. I think, second was we've clearly seen in the market a shift from funds that maybe were kind of focused on a label, ESG, sustainability funds, sometimes using things like third-party ESG scores, sometimes just really underweighting carbon-intensive industry and overweighting carbon-light companies. I think what we've seen is that the challenge with that is you're not actually then putting capital into the companies that may be carbon-intensive today. So that's why I started by saying your portfolio may look higher from a carbon intensity perspective, but those actually could be the companies that are making the biggest investments in green CapEx to decarbonize, making big biofuels acquisitions. So you're not kind of seeing that come through the company yet, or big commitments to scale up, for example, EV production on the auto manufacturing side. So I think that the kind of headline is the evolution that we're seeing is institutional investors and I think financial institutions really working to have an accurate measure that allows them to contribute capital in the way that's going to be most effective in ultimately delivering decarbonization across the economy.
Joaquin, I'm going to turn to you next because I think Kara mentioned, as we see the approaches to finance evolve and that evolution being necessary to properly value, efforts to decarbonize the really carbon intensive stuff, right? That's a space where hydrogen has a role to play. So I might ask you, how are you and CEPSA approaching this issue of financing, your various projects? What are the variables you see as most important? And I think, again, when we return to this idea that Greg mentioned about, you develop these markets when you're able to incentivize the demand side, right? So it kind of, in a way, comes down to who pays the bill, right? How do we think of that final part of the payment pipeline and in our thinking and strategizing around financing the projects that are necessary, whether that's to decarbonize heavy industry or to deliver just more power to the consumer?
It's interesting that you connect these 2 points, financing and securing the demand and who pays, because basically financing is paid by the final customer. So what we do is we include from the very beginning in the design of the project the off-takers. And when I talk about off-takers, I not necessarily mean the industrial or the heavy transportation company. I talk about the final user of the transportation services or the final user of the products that the industrial is producing. And this is to connect about who pays for this bill, because in Europe we have certain regulations. We have the Fuel Maritime, Refuel Europe, we have the ETS, paying for carbon emissions, which is either penalizing or stimulating demand. But this is at the industrial level. But then we have, and I like to put an example, other, let's say, markets where there is no stimulation or penalties or emissions or something like that, that people are very willing to pay a premium. And I may ask, who is buying here free-range eggs? Many people will raise their hands, and they are very expensive, sometimes 2 times, 3 times the cost of a standard egg. And there is no regulation, no obligation, that people are willing to pay for many reasons, for health, for the goodness of the hens, I don't know. The thing is, here we see there is a lot of awareness about emissions, and people are willing to pay an extra premium to use services that are decarbonized or products that are decarbonized. The question is how much and who is paying for that. And if we talk about maritime sector, for instance, we did a calculation. When you talk about a very big container ship who is bringing goods from the Far East, you talk about a ship that is moving around 20,000 containers, and within each container you find cell phone, tablets, sneakers. So if you pay twice the cost of a standard fossil fuel, and then you have this comparison between fossil and decarbonized fuel, and you say this is twice, this is too much. But if you talk in terms of the transportation cost of each of the single item that this ship is carrying, you talk about euro cents. So nothing. If you talk about an airplane ticket, you talk about barely 5 euros per ticket of a twice as expensive SAF. And it's not twice. We're talking about, yes, maybe a little bit more expensive. There is a learning curve, but we are starting by offering the products, the sustainable aviation fuel, the marine fuels, at a slight premium to fossil fuels. That is already within the difference between the fossil and green that Europe is subsidizing through the ETS. But then we realize that there are companies that they are very aware that their customers are willing to pay this premium to buy products that are decarbonized. This is what we build in our relationships from the beginning. We partner with these kind of companies. The fertilizer company I mentioned before, they are using the green hydrogen to produce green fertilizers, who are then sold to companies who are selling foods that are decarbonized. And they are already doing that. So there is a demand for this. And this is what we incorporate in the projects from the very beginning, so the projects are financeable, because we have secured the offtake for the long term.
We're approaching the end of our session, and so I want to finish off with a lightning round, because the one way we really haven't talked about the issue today is how we're thinking about this in the context of these 2 weeks at COP28, where issues around accelerating renewable energy deployment in the developing world is on the agenda, where how we finance all of this is on the agenda. But also, with a stock-taking exercise happening in the background, we have this incredible sense of urgency to move immensely quickly. If there's a word for, even faster than immensely, I leave it to you guys to help out with that. But starting with you, Joaquin, to give kind of a last word on this stuff, how should we be thinking about this in the context of COP? And what do you hope to see come out of the COP to advance these particular issues? We'll start with you, and then we'll go to Kara, and we'll wrap up with Greg because he went first, so he gets to go last.
So what I expect, what I hope, what I wish is that we come into real action. So we used to say that I come from the power industry, and when renewables were starting to be developed, we said we should move from the PowerPoint to the power plant. So now it's the time to do the same, to move fast and very decisive to achieve decarbonization in the short term.
I would say, probably a theme throughout all my comments, commercial viability, I think it's going to increase the speed, and there are policy levers to do that we talked about. There's also a tremendous amount of innovation that can help with that as well that's happening in the private sector. Everything from, off-take agreements, that creates demand, to, in the emerging markets context, just thinking about innovative financing structures as well.
All right, Greg.
Look, around the world, one of the challenges we have is the risk of citizen backlash. We have already seen it in elections in a couple of European countries. It fosters climate denial in the world-leading science country of the United States. And so I think there's a weird dichotomy that policymakers, and forgive me, financiers and industrialists, all like to talk about the very big picture stuff. And we completely fail to join up what that means at the demand side, what it means for consumers, citizens, and voters. Now, you pointed out there just how little extra it costs to switch an end product from being a climate destroying to climate neutral. And I think what we have to do now, while we're here, is work out how we're going to make this good for citizens as well as good for the climate. Because if we create any sense that it's going to be a sacrifice for citizens, it's not going to happen.
I think that's a great way to wrap us up, because I think when you look at how we started this session talking about the challenge and the ominous nature of big infrastructure, recognizing that how you make those big infrastructure projects more feasible is perhaps to think about it as a cost to consumer problem, right? And stimulating the ecosystem of demand is a way to catalyze or at least improve some of the financial viability of the projects we need to get into the ground ASAP. So with that, hugely appreciate our panelists for joining us today. We're going to be doing any number of additional panels here over the rest of the afternoon at the Global Decarbonization Accelerator, as well as throughout the balance of COP28 over the next 2 weeks. So with that, I'd love to give our panelists a round of applause, and thank you, everybody.